All right, I guess we'll get going. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Hope everyone's doing well so far in San Francisco here. I've got a little bit of intro, and then I'll be doing a bunch of demos of building Azure, building Jenkins actually on Azure in the cloud. So how many people here are using a cloud? Have deployed things to a VM or something like that? Just a show of hands. Okay, just a couple? Okay, good. How many people have used Docker? Just look around. Okay, a few more. Kubernetes? All right, okay. How many people worked with virtual machines in general, just deploying Jenkins to virtual machines and stuff? Okay, so these concepts will be, I'm just trying to gauge how much explanation I need to do. So my name is Brian Benz. I'm a cloud developer advocate at Microsoft. I've been specializing in Java and by extension Jenkins for a few years now. And my background before that was IBM and Deloitte and some startups and things like that. And today I'm going to talk about what you need to do to deploy Jenkins to the cloud and also Jenkins artifacts to the cloud. So we'll talk about both. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Azure ecosystem and what we have you can use to actually work with Jenkins, tools and services that we have to make it easier, and then we'll go into a few demos deploying Azure to VMs, deploying Jenkins to VMs, deploying Jenkins to Kubernetes, and deploying artifacts to Azure plugins. Are any of you guys, just a show of hands, did any of you guys miss my workshop on Monday? Anybody that was planning to go to that? Okay, all right, well, that's not bad then, no hands. I had food poisoning, I couldn't make it, so I'm gonna try and make up a little bit of that in this session. So we got about 45 minutes to go through this. These are some of the considerations you wanna use when you're building apps and deploying them to VMs. We have virtual machines, Ubuntu. We have Linux and Windows virtual machines. Fun fact, about 40% of the virtual machines on Microsoft Azure are Linux, mostly Ubuntu, and that number keeps growing. It's kind of interesting. We have a lot of Linux business. Some people are surprised to hear that Microsoft has so much Linux, but that's the way it is in the cloud world. So there's different things you can do. You can take your apps, you can actually take Jenkins or your artifacts, deploy them to virtual machines on Windows or Linux. You can deploy them to Kubernetes as long as they're Dockerized. And we have a bunch of partners we've been working with to actually deploy and build the tools that I'm going to show you today. Red Hat, IBM, Azure Systems for Java, Terraform, CloudBees, and a few other things. And basically, part of those services we have for security, Azure Active Directory. We also have a thing called Azure Key Vault, and I'll explain what that is later. Some other database migration services. We have some databases, commonly, MongoDB, MySQL, Postgres. We support those. Of course, we support Microsoft SQL Server as well. And we got a lot of customers using this. So how you actually deploy things, our philosophy at Microsoft is that if you have invested in Bash, you've invested in Jenkins, you've invested in Terraform, Kubernetes, Helm, Draft, all these things, open source packages, then we want to make sure you can preserve your investment when you're running on our cloud. And so we actually support and work with partners. We also have our own tools. VS Code is an open source free text editor. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that, but here's a Terraform file running in VS Code. It's very popular these days, over 1 million downloads. We also have what used to be called VSTS, is now called Azure DevOps, and that's a tool for deploying things out to Azure. It's built into Azure. Free private Git repos. If anyone's interested in free private Git repos, you can get those through Azure DevOps. We're not trying to replace Jenkins with this. Jenkins has its own build and ecosystem and plugins, and that's great. And what we've done with Azure DevOps is build tools to allow you to deploy in both platforms. So if you have, I know a lot of large companies already use what they call Team Validation Server, which is the basis for Azure DevOps. If they already have that running, great. We have tools and plugins that allow you to trigger Jenkins builds and Jenkins deploys and other Jenkins facilities from there. And Jenkins can be used interactively with Azure DevOps as well. We built a ton of plugins. Let me show you this. We've got a lot of plugins for Jenkins. Where are they? There they are. We've actually built these in conjunction with Jenkins. I don't know if any of you saw the DevOps Theater session yesterday with myself and Olivier Vernon. We actually work with Jenkins. Jenkins uses Azure to build Jenkins. And they actually have, let me see here, CI to Azure. Here it is right here. This is actually Jenkins running on Azure. If you look over here on the left, there's a build executor status. What happens is pull requests come in to the Jenkins projects. There's not many today, and I noticed this yesterday as well. Not too many pull requests coming in this week because everyone's at the conference busy, but we're getting a few, and generally what happens is the pull request comes in. We have a master job that's running. We have a lot of open source Linux and also Windows VMs and Kubernetes containers that actually run to test all this. So let's say a PR comes in, you want to test and make sure it works on Windows, several versions of Ubuntu Linux, maybe CentOS, a few other platforms. You can actually run those, run tests, and get the results of those down here. And this is actually live Jenkins building Jenkins right here at ci.jenkins.io, and that's on Azure. So we built these plugins in conjunction with Jenkins, and I'll show you a little bit the details of some of that in a while. One of the ones that we're highlighting, because we just announced it on Monday, is the Azure Container Registry build. So how many people have used Docker Hub? Okay, just a couple of you. All right. So Docker, as you know, you can build containers. Then you can have a private registry that you can use to actually store your containers. And that private registry can be used to deploy things. For example, if you build an application and you just want to share it with the world, you can put that out on Docker Hub. And anybody can go out to Docker Hub and grab that. It's all public. But if there's some credentials or something in there that connects to a backend database, you don't want to use a public forum to actually share that. So what you do is you build your own registry. You can use any registry. In this case, we have one that we've built called Azure Container Registry, which is scalable and secure. And so you can take your application with all its specific information for your organization, put it on the Azure Container Registry, and deploy it from there to wherever you want in your ecosystem that you're using, Docker, Kubernetes, et cetera, et cetera. What we've done here with the Azure Container Registry is you can actually trigger build processes. So if you have a GitHub or something local, you can trigger a build process that not only brings those artifacts into Azure Container Registry, it also builds them and tests them before you actually deploy them out. So it's a little bit more automated step. That's one of the plugins we just released on Monday. So sample Java CI pipelines in Azure. For example, the dev commits some code on GitHub. You go through your build process, your test process, just like I showed you in ci.jenkins.org. You deploy it out to a container registry. In this case, it could be Azure Container or anywhere else. Use Spinnaker. By the way, how many people here use or have heard of Spinnaker? All right, it's a tool for actually managing deployments, and it's a pretty cool thing. We actually participate heavily with that as an open source project. And then from there, you can actually deploy things out to Azure Container Service. Another sample pipeline you could do is a dev commits code. You build it. You don't want to put it in a registry. You just want to deploy some artifacts out to somewhere where people can grab them. And it doesn't have to be Docker. It could be any exe, Java jar file, anything you could imagine. You just deploy those out to Azure Storage, and we actually have an Azure Storage plugin that allows you to do that easily. I'll show that a little bit later. And then you can build another CD pipeline that actually deploys that out to an Azure web app or a website or anything you want. All right, so here's a dev test platform, a sample one that we put together at Microsoft. And we actually built some templates to allow you to deploy this easily. That's going to be my first demo. So the whole idea here is you've got developers, you've got Jenkins that actually triggers a master. And that master triggers agents that go out and run different processes, testing, building. And then you've got Docker images that can do the same thing. Next, you get, this actually deploys out to Jenkins.io. We've got a backup. And from Jenkins.io, you can build the Jenkins.io website on mobile and download. So that's kind of cool. So this is just a sample architecture. It's based on the Jenkins.io website, but we're just using this for building stuff. So how do you actually provision something like this? So I'm going to show you an example of that architecture in action in a little bit. How do you actually provision these things? So if you want to actually deploy something, of course you can do it from Jenkins, but what if you don't have Jenkins yet? You need to go either into the Azure portal. We also have an Azure CLI, which runs on Windows, Mac, or Linux. And we actually have a very cool CLI I'm going to show you in a minute. We also support what we call ARM templates. This is a way to build a very complicated infrastructure. Most of our partners do that, and I'll show you why in a minute. And then we support Terraform as well. How many people here are using Terraform for anything at organizations? Yeah, okay, so what we've done is basically, as I mentioned before, we're all about protecting your investments. If you're using Terraform, and we found a lot of our customers are, for multi-cloud deployments, we want to be able to support that. We've created a thing called Azure Provider for Terraform. So let me just go in and I'll show you some of this now. The Azure Quick Start templates, where are they now? I have too many things going on. Azure Quick Start templates here are templates that you can use for building anything on Azure. Of course, you can use Terraform, et cetera, et cetera. But these ones are kind of interesting because this is 14 of them that actually build Jenkins. So if you want to build Jenkins on Kubernetes, for example, you want to build Jenkins on web apps or VMs, we actually have templates for that. And what I've done is I've actually built in a template to do that. Actually, before I do that, let me show you this. Oh no, my Cloud Shell timed out. That always happens when I do a presentation. So this is something pretty cool. If you guys want to just deploy something, you don't want to learn about ARM templates, but you want to use Bash, and you don't even want to install our CLI that we provide for free, it's open source on GitHub, you don't have to do any of that. You can go, if you have an Azure subscription, you can go to shell.azure.com, which is what you're seeing on the screen here, and you can simply deploy things using the Azure CLI. It's built in. But what if you don't want to learn that? We have Terraform built in as well. Hopefully it comes up. Sometimes it's a bit of a delay. So Terraform's built into this as well. So you can go to shell.azure.com. You can use a Terraform file you already have, a TF file, and you can actually build things out to Azure using our Azure Terraform provider. There might be some slight adjustments you want to make if you built something on AWS or something else, because we use slightly different packages and different names for our services like virtual machines and things like that. But you could basically use a Terraform file. And this is the cool part. What if you want to edit a Terraform file? You don't have any editor or anything. This is shell.azure.com. I mentioned before we have Visual Studio Code. We've actually built Visual Studio Code into the shell. So you don't need to use Vi or anything else that you're used to using for this kind of stuff. This works on Windows, Mac, Linux, anything with a browser. Actually works, we have an iPhone app and an Android app that this runs on as well. You can use the shell inside your, once you log in with your subscription information, you can use the shell in there as well. So where's the Terraform? I actually loaded a Terraform file in here earlier. So that's the same Terraform file that I loaded earlier. You've got 5 gigs of storage that comes with your Azure account to actually store anything you want out here on the cloud. So you can actually build this, share it. And when you log in with your Azure account, you just go to shell.azure.com. It fires up the console, and then from there you can type code, and it fires up a code text editor that you can use. And as you can see, you have full text syntax control with Terraform and a bunch of other platforms. We've got Cloud Foundry built in, OpenShift soon, Terraform, and a bunch of other providers that have their own CLIs. We've actually built this into this as well. So that's kind of cool. All right, so Azure Quick Start templates. As I mentioned before, there's a number of those. And I took one, and I actually built, let's see where it is. So this is one of the Quick Start templates you could use, and it creates a Jenkins server on an Azure Linux VM, an Ubuntu VM. Not only does it create a Linux server running Jenkins ready for you to go, it also creates, it installs a bunch of plugins that you can use automatically to start building things like Jenkins agents. So our Jenkins agent plugin, you have a Jenkins master that's running. The Jenkins agent plugin allows you to use Azure VMs or Kubernetes to run Jenkins agent processes, okay? So let me show you the end result of all this. So I actually deployed this earlier. You have to set up an SSH certificate. Once you set that up, you are able to run the template. You plug in the information you need. Actually, let's go there first. This is the actual Jenkins process that you would use. This is in the Azure portal. You say, get it now. Don't mean to get too technical on you, but you press the get it now button. And then it actually opens up an ARM template. ARM templates, as I mentioned before, are a way of deploying things on Azure. And we built this one for you, but you could edit it. It's based on JSON. And so here's the actual ARM template. I could just say create. So basically from here, you create Jenkins, you create a username, you put a password. In this case, I use the SSH. I just use SSH keygen. By the way, how many people here use Windows as a desktop or for a development laptop? Okay. So if you get git bash, let me show you this command prompt. So git bash, if you install git bash, you can actually use, sorry, you probably can't see it at the back, but you can use SSH keygen now in a command prompt on Azure, and you can also use SSH itself. So we're actually building slowly a lot of bash commands into a command prompt on Windows. So if you're using Windows and you want to use a bash command, just try it on Windows in the command prompt. And if you get updates regularly, you'll probably find that a lot of stuff is working that would surprise you. We also have this thing called Windows Subsystem for Linux, which you can download. It's an Ubuntu Linux image. It runs on Windows, and you can use that for your build. So anyway, you can build, I used SSH keygen to build this public key, and then you select a whole bunch of other settings, and it takes about 10 minutes, and you actually build Jenkins. And this is the Jenkins I built. I created a little sample Spring Music deploy job here, which basically deploys Gradle, uses a Gradle wrapper, builds Gradle for you, and then you can deploy this out to a virtual machine. The cool thing I want to show you is this particular instance. If you use that template that I showed you, you go into Configure System, and it actually preloads a bunch of images for you into Jenkins. And if I scroll down here, you'll see Cloud. Under the Cloud section, Microsoft Azure VM Agents. And what you do here, you set up what's called a service principal. It's the Azure credentials. So everyone's probably familiar with an SSH certificate, which is basically to say to some place out on the web, this is me. Here's my private key. Please communicate with my public key. And I have authenticated that I am me, and you can talk to me securely. We've added a little step into a different type of credential, which is called service principal. The service principal says, not only am I me, but this is my Azure subscription information. So I hereby authorize anybody who has this service principal, this credential, to deploy things on behalf of my subscription on Azure. And the reason why you want to do that is I've set up a VM here. This is actually a VM running Jenkins. I want to build other VMs using my subscription. This agent plugin allows you to use virtual machines as your target for Jenkins agents. So you've got a Jenkins master, which is what we're looking at here, on Azure virtual machine. Then you want to call agents. Each one of those agents could be a Windows VM. It could be a Linux VM of multiple different flavors, and could be a Kubernetes cluster that you're running as well. You set that all up here. And here's a general configuration. For those of you at the back, I apologize, the screen's kind of small. Let me see if I can make this bigger. There we go. So it's still probably kind of small back there, but the idea here is I've got several agents. I've got a Windows agent. It's going to have Windows. It's going to run it in the Japan West region because we have a bunch of different regions you can run things in. In this case, we just picked Japan West. Why not? Then you can say, what's the virtual machine size that you want to use? And there's all kinds of categories for that. And then a storage account, because there has to be a storage account associated with a virtual machine. And then we're going to have managed disks. I won't get into the details of what that is, but it's just a way of keeping your VMs under control. And then the Azure VM idle retention strategy. So let's say I'm creating, in this case, I want to create up here up to 10 VMs, and we're going to have the deployment timeout of 1,200 seconds. If that VM is idle for a certain amount of time, we have a choice of shutting down the VM to save money or putting it into a sleep mode so it's ready for the next time you call an agent process. In this case, the retention strategy is we're going to keep this VM. It's going to sit there idle for 60 minutes. After 60 minutes, it'll shut down to save money, just in case you don't need it anymore. Usage, you can actually call labels by node. So you can say, I only want to build Windows in this particular case, or I want to build Linux. And we have two built-in images for you, Windows Server 2016 and Ubuntu 16.04, the most common. You can also use your own images as well. You can pre-install tools, the latest Git, Maven, Docker on there. You can also set up scripts that are actually automatically published as well. So I want to bring in Maven, I want to bring in my application, I want to run some tests based on something I've already pre-configured, and then I want to report back to the master and tell you whether or not that test failed or succeeded. Same thing for Linux. So here, Linux, we're doing Japan West again, different kind of storage account, managed disk, et cetera, et cetera. So a whole bunch of different configuration options you've got here. So the idea here is this agent, I can have a Jenkins master, it calls up to 10 virtual machines with different configurations, and those 10 different machines can report back to the Jenkins master and tell you if it succeeded or failed with a build, with a deploy, et cetera, et cetera. And this is similar to what we've done with, I'm going back to ci.jenkins.org, which is where they're building Jenkins. Wow, we got a big build queue here. But the status, oh, look at that. So they've got a whole bunch of things. It looks like some PRs just went through. And they're building a whole bunch of different tests. They're using that agent plugin that I just showed you to actually run these tests building Jenkins on Azure right now. So that's just a little bit about that. Oh, one other thing I was going to show you. I'll show that later, actually. I'm going to show you storage as well. Uh-oh, what happened here? There it is. OK. Thought I lost it. Oh, so I already covered the Windows subsystem for Linux, the Azure CLI, and the Azure Shell. I showed you how you can do that, and you can create code from there. The VMs, there's tons of ways to get started with VMs. Let's go back to the Azure portal for a second. So that's the one where I created Jenkins. This is Brian's Jenkins right here. So this is actually what got created, by the way. When I ran that Azure template, it creates a VM, a disk, a network interface, network security group, storage account, a public IP address in a virtual network. So it actually sets all that up for you. You don't have to set it up yourself. That template that I built does that. All right, so the other thing I want to show you is the dashboard. This is a general dashboard. If I want to create a resource now, and this is the Azure Marketplace that I referred to in that slide. So we've worked with a ton of partners. Just type Jenkins in here. Make that bigger. Still not big enough, I don't think, for the back. Sorry about that. But you've got some screens over there, I guess. But the idea here is we've got a whole bunch of different Jenkins implementations, including CloudBees and a few others. These use ARM templates. The CloudBees, for example, uses the ARM templates that I showed you before to actually build Jenkins. In this case, it'll build a CloudBees image that's ready to go. We also have other things from Cognosys, a hardened Jenkins. We have a Bitnami image, which is just a single image. If you're familiar with using Bitnami images on virtual machines, that's a pretty easy one to use. We've got JFrog Artifactory, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a whole bunch of things you can use that actually work with Jenkins or are Jenkins related. If you just go into the Azure portal, portal.azure.com, and search on Jenkins, you'll find all these. So that's the marketplace. That's how you can actually do that. You can actually build your own images as well and put them into the marketplace. It's not hard to do. You use a Hyper-V image, and anyone could do it. Or you can bring your own image. So you can, when you're actually building things from the portal or the CLI, you can actually refer to your own images. It can be inside your own organization. And those are accessible via any URI. So deploying Jenkins on Azure VMs, actually I already showed this. So the idea here is we built that ARM template. It has one single Jenkins VM, and then you can scale agents out of that based on the agents plugin that I showed you, the configuration up to 10 VMs. We actually also have, in association with that, Azure Active Directory. We have Azure Key Vault, which is being used to pass the credentials. Like I said before, it's a way of identifying not only you, but your subscription when you're building resources on Azure. So they can run independently. You don't need to be actually physically there to create or give any permissions. You actually give the permissions through the service principal. So one of the interesting things as well we have is VM scale sets. You can have up to 1,000 VMs fired up through a script, through the CLI, through the portal. Here's an example using the CLI of the script. It's just az vms create, and you can do this through that shell that I showed you, or you can download the CLI as well, or from your phone. You can actually create 1,000 VMs from your phone. This is going to create 1,000 VMs. It's going to create them in a resource group, which is a way of grouping things. And then you name it, and you use the latest version of Ubuntu. And let's throw in a load balancer and a subnet. So that's all you need to do. That would take a little while to run. I'm guessing to fire up the 1,000 VMs, but you could do that. Then there are auto-scale rules for that as well. So everybody's familiar with Kubernetes. You can create pods, shut them down. A lot of customers are using VMs as well instead of Kubernetes. And in our scale sets, we have rules for actually generating scale. In this case, you can have a minimum number of VMs in this particular configuration of 1. You can have a maximum of 10. If the CPU percentage on the VMs goes over 75%, add another VM. So you start with 1. It goes over 75%. Now you've got 2, et cetera, until you get to 10. If any of those CPUs get below 25%, shut them down. There are more time-based rules and things like that as well. So if you have a lot of business on Mondays and you need, between the hours of X and Y, a certain amount of VMs, you can actually set those up as well through the scale set rules. So deploying to Jenkins VMs, I actually already showed you that. The other thing I want to show you is container technologies, deploying things out to container service. We also have something called Service Fabric, which is a way to manage microservices, and that could be in multiple languages. And we also have app service as well, which is single container apps. And the idea behind these is, as with Kubernetes, You don't need to necessarily worry about the back-end infrastructure. Our Azure Container Service and our Azure Kubernetes Service allow you to actually build Kubernetes using our CLI. We manage the VMs for you. We manage the updates to the VMs, updates to Kubernetes, et cetera, et cetera. All you have to worry about is how many pods you have and how they're running, and if you need to shut them down or restart them. Service Fabric takes that to another level and actually manages your microservices as well. So not only the pods get managed, like Kubernetes, but also manages your code and the applications that run on top of Service Fabric. And then App Service is just a way, if you have, let's say in the Java world, because that's where I come from, if you have a jar file and you just want to run it on Java, you can fire up a Tomcat image in our App Service, which is already pre-configured, and all you have to do is drop the jar or WAR file into our App Service, and it'll run automatically for you. So you don't have to set anything up. It's what we call worker roles, and they just fire up and run your application for you. So Kubernetes architecture. What we've got here is a basic Kubernetes control architecture. You've got a master node with an API server. You've got a controller. Then you've got some kubelets and some proxies. And up here, you've got, how many people pronounce it kubectl? I still tempted to, but kube control, I know. Anyway, the one thing I want to show you here, just a little tip, is, so if you want to deploy Jenkins to Kubernetes, you can do it. You can use our AKS service, or you can create your own VMs and build your own Kubernetes on top of VMs, which a lot of people do. Our Kubernetes service, we don't charge for the control plane, so it's basically the same price if you use the VMs or our automated service. And I mentioned before, you get patching and all kinds of things with our service. Now, what if you just want to quickly get Kubernetes up and running on Azure or on another cloud, actually? This is a great website to know about, hub.kubeapps.com. How many people here are familiar with Helm? Okay, just a few. So, so the idea here is you've got a Docker file, right? And if you go out to the Docker hub, let's see, hub docker.com. So this is the Docker hub. Oh, looks like I haven't been here for a while. Won't let me in. Why not? Oh, I need to put an address, password. Yeah, never mind. If you go into the hub.docker.com and log in, which it used to be open public, you can get a Jenkins image. There's a Docker file out there. You can get Jenkins, and it's basically just a Docker file with Jenkins already set up and running. All right. So what if you want to take that Docker file and run it on Kubernetes? You can do that locally, but if you go to hub.kubeapp.com, what this does, it's a Jenkins Helm chart. So Helm is a product, actually it's a company that Microsoft bought a couple years ago called Deis. They build two things called Draft and Helm. If you want to build Kubernetes infrastructures, you need to build a Kubernetes manifest file. So you start with a Docker file of Jenkins, and then you need to build a manifest file, which is a YAML file with all kinds of settings in there for actually what do you want. How many nodes do you want in your Kubernetes cluster? Do you want to have a front end like Nginx? Do you want to have load balancing? Do you know, et cetera, et cetera. How do you actually manage them? When do you build pods? When do you shut them down? That's all handled by Helm. There's a tool called Draft you can use to actually easily build. If you build a Kubernetes infrastructure exactly the way you like it, locally or on a VM, you can use Draft to actually build a sample YAML file, which is a manifest, and then you can actually publish that as a chart. And Helm is where you do that. If you go to kubeapps.com, this actually is a way of building a simple Kubernetes cluster using Jenkins, using a Docker file. It actually builds it for you. All you need to do is just sign in here. You fire up Kubernetes. You just fire up the Helm install, and then my release stable Jenkins, and it's actually going to build a Kubernetes cluster for you based on the parameters that you actually include in this file down here. And here's all the listed parameters you can use, how many nodes you want, et cetera, et cetera. There's, as you can see, it gets quite complicated. And I don't know, how many people have built Kubernetes manifests before? A couple? How'd you like it? It's not much fun, huh? I've done it myself, and I was really glad to find Draft and Helm and be able to use this. And then I was really even happier to know that they built this kubeapps hub that you can use to actually deploy these things automatically. So people build these, and there's a whole bunch of different apps, not just Jenkins, but a whole bunch of different apps you can use. Sometimes these are built by vendors, sometimes they're built by open source developers, and you can publish them here on kubeapps and easily deploy them. So it's a little tip there on deploying those in Kubernetes. Oh, what are we doing for time? Okay. So the next thing I want to mention, we have Azure App Service. You can actually deploy to Azure App Service. You can use web apps, mobile apps, logic apps, which is like functions, and then APIs as well. We have an app service for Windows, of course, because we're Microsoft, but we also have an app service for Linux, and it runs on Ubuntu. You can take any Docker image and you can deploy it out to app service, so you just drop your Docker image into our app service and it'll run automatically. There's a few different things you can use to configure it, but it's pretty straightforward. And I'm going to show you some examples of using plugins in a bit. So Azure DevOps Services and Jenkins integration. So I mentioned before we have our own DevOps services. You can get free private Git repos and source control and a whole bunch of other things you don't get with Jenkins. But you can also add Jenkins to the build and deploy, test and release. We have these extensions that we built. They're like plugins that allow you to use Jenkins, for example, on an Azure DevOps build and deploy task. You can trigger, instead of ours, you can trigger a Jenkins task. So you already have Jenkins. We preserve that investment. You can still continue to use it. Same with test and release as well. So you can control test and release. We have rollback and a whole bunch of other things. And we actually add monitoring and analytics as well. So we have app insights. We also have SDKs and services, not just for Java, but for other tools as well. And these allow you to use the programming languages that you're used to, like Java, Ruby, PHP, Python, to actually access our services. So let's say you want to build MongoDB database service, or you want to build a MySQL service, or some of the other options we have. Media services is a good one. It manages videos for you, so you can actually, you don't have to worry about the encoding or the streaming or managing scale. Everything's built in for you. So we actually have SDKs for that. So deploying artifacts with Azure plugins. I'm just going to show you this real quick because we don't have a lot of time left. Let's see. Go back to the dashboard. So this is the Jenkins dashboard. I mentioned I'm going to show you this later. Basically, you add a storage account here. This is another one of the plugins that we created when that template was created. You add a storage account and you set up your own service principal, your credentials for actually deploying to that storage account. From there, you can actually add and deploy to Azure Storage and a bunch of other things. Let me just go to Jenkins here. Oh, yeah, I want to leave. And I will show you. Manage Jenkins, manage plugins. So these are the plugins that are automatically installed for me when I built this, including the Azure Container Agents plugin, so I can deploy to Azure Containers, Container Service, Azure Credentials for managing all the credentials I have, Azure VM Agents, and then Azure Storage too. So there's a bunch of, as I mentioned, there's like 16 different plugins. You can plug them in here, and then all you have to do is add your credentials. You create, for example, a storage account in Azure, which is what I did up here in my Azure account. If I go here, Brian's Jenkins Storage, here's my storage account. I go down here, I get my access keys, which I won't show you right now, and then you plug those into your Jenkins plugin, and that automatically will deploy things out to Azure Storage based on some scripts that you build. So you want to deploy artifacts out to Azure, from Jenkins. You just add that plugin, put in your credentials, and all of a sudden you've got an ability to do that. I'm running out of time here, unfortunately. There's some resources here I just want to show you. The Jenkins solution template. These will be shared later. There's the Jenkins hub, which you can find all that info. ci.jenkins.org is the place where Jenkins builds Jenkins on Azure. And we will take some questions. Please do follow me, bbenz, on Twitter as well. And we've got about 5-10 minutes for questions. Go ahead. Yes? Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Too far away. Yes, so the question was, could you deploy the deployment slots using Azure App Service? And the answer is yes. So the Azure App Service, let's see, Azure Service deployment slots. What deployment slots are is just a way to allow you to manage whatever you deploy to Azure App Service. As I mentioned before, it's an easy way to just take a file, drop it into Azure. Well, we've also actually created a little bit of a source control. It's not officially source control, but a lot of people use it for that. And basically, oh, wow, we're in Stackify. And basically what that does is it allows you to drop something into our app service, test it out using blue-green deployments. And if you like it, you can swap the deployment slot that's used for test with the deployment slot for production. All of a sudden, your users are using that, and you can swap back if that didn't work. So we have deployment slots that allow you to do that. And the answer is yes. So you can use deployment slots specifically for the app service plugin, yes. Any other questions? Yes? Yeah, the question is are these plugins, are they available as a package? And no, they're not. Unfortunately, you have to select each one individually. There's 16 of them. And the ones that are built by the Azure DevOps team, there's some actually built by third parties, Azure publisher setting credentials. Obviously, I suggest using the DevOps team one first, but you have to install them each individually. It's pretty easy, though. It's just a literally checkbox. So you can just do a search and deploy them. Yes, yeah, this is actually the Jenkins plugin portal. So the question was, are they available in the Jenkins plugin portal? Yes, they are. So they're all officially registered and tested by Jenkins. And like I say, we actually work with Jenkins. That website I show you, ci.jenkins.org, most of those plugins are battle tested, literally, on that installation. So we know they work every day. And if there are any issues, the Jenkins team's really good at getting back to us and telling us. So, yeah. Any other questions? No, nothing? Uh-oh. Okay, well, I'm going to be around. It's 2:13. I finished at 2:15, so I'll be around a couple more minutes. And I guess we'll make room for the next session. And thanks for coming. And enjoy the rest of the conference. So thank you.